In 1861, chemistry entered a new age of detection. A British chemist named William Crookes used a fresh tool called the spectroscope, a device that split light into coloured lines like a fingerprint. He examined material from industrial acids and expected the familiar pattern of known substances. Instead, one signal refused to fit. A vivid green line appeared where no textbook placed it. Something in his sample did not have a name yet. Crookes treated that green line as evidence, not decoration. If each element produced its own set of lines, then an unrecognized line meant an unrecognized element. He repeated the tests, checked different samples, and watched the same green flash return. The result stayed stubbornly consistent. This was not an error in glass or flame. It was a new substance announcing itself through light. The spectroscope did not guess. It revealed. Now, Crookes faced the next step, turning a spectral clue into a real material he could hold and study. He traced the signal back to residues left behind after chemical processing, concentrating them again and again. The green line remained his guide, confirming he stayed on the right trail. When he accepted that he had found a new element, he named it thallium, after the Greek word for a green shoot. A discovery began as a single line. Once thallium had a name, chemists rushed to do what they always did next: separate it, purify it, and test how it behaved. They turned it into salts, mixed it into solutions, and watched how easily it moved from one form to another. It acted like other familiar metals, and that familiarity felt reassuring. But early handling brought odd reports: weakness, stomach trouble, strange fatigue. The element had not stayed politely inside the glassware. As the compounds multiplied, so did the unease. Thallium slipped into the body without drama. No sharp smell, no immediate burn, nothing that warned a person to back away. Small exposures seemed to build, not pass. Researchers noticed that it affected living tissue in a way that looked ordinary at first, like flu, like food poisoning, like overwork. Then the problems lingered, recovery dragged. The poison behaved like a quiet intruder, not a sudden attack. The more carefully they observed, the clearer the danger became. Thallium did not simply irritate, it disrupted. It interfered with basic processes cells relied on, and it did it across the body, not in one obvious place. That made it hard to recognize and easy to dismiss. It also meant a person could be harmed long before anyone suspected a metal was involved. Thallium had stopped being a discovery and started being a threat. By the late 1800s, thallium stopped being a name that lived only in scientific papers. Chemists turned it into salts that could be made, shipped, and sold. And commerce did what commerce always did. It spread the material outward into workshops, small factories, and supply catalogues. The danger did not vanish as it left the lab. It simply became easier to touch, easier to inhale, and easier to mishandle. Industry found uses for these thallium salts because they behaved in convenient, profitable ways. They helped certain manufacturing processes, and they fit into the growing world of chemical products that promised better results with less effort. But the same properties that made them useful also made them risky. Workers faced exposure through dust and residues, often without clear warnings. The poison met ordinary routines, and ordinary routines rarely treated it as extraordinary. At the same time, thallium salts slipped into early medical use, offered in a period when new chemicals often reached patients before their full costs were understood. Small doses sounded controlled, even modern. Yet the line between remedy and harm stayed thin, and the people handling these products did not need to be chemists. This was the turning point. Thallium became available in everyday channels and public exposure stopped being rare. In the early 1900s, thallium stopped being a specialty chemical and started being sold for a simple promise: pest control. Rats ruined food stores, spread disease, and terrified city homes. Insects damaged crops and warehouses. Thallium salts, cheap and effective, fit the moment. Manufacturers packaged them as practical solutions, something you could buy, store, and use without a laboratory. The problem was how thallium worked. It did not just repel pests, it poisoned them quietly, often after a delay. That made it attractive for extermination campaigns because animals kept feeding before they weakened, but the same delay also hid danger from people. A dusting on floors, bait left within reach, residue on hands, small contact could become a serious exposure. As thallium products spread, the settings multiplied: apartments, farms, grain facilities, and workshops. Workers handled concentrates, mixed powders, and cleaned contaminated areas. Families used it in kitchens and basements where food and children existed nearby. The chemical's reach changed its role in society. It no longer waited in industrial corners. It sat on ordinary shelves, ready to poison by accident as easily as by intent. By the middle of the 20th century, thallium no longer hid behind confusion. Hospital records began to line up in a familiar order. First came the stomach disaster. Sudden nausea, vomiting, cramping, and relentless diarrhea that looked like food poisoning or a bad infection. Doctors treated what they could see, but the usual explanations failed. Patients did not bounce back. Instead, a second phase arrived, and it made the earlier sickness feel like a warning. Days later, the damage moved into the nerves. Pain appeared in the hands and feet, then burning, tingling, weakness, and trouble walking. Some patients became so sensitive that a light touch hurt. Others lost reflexes, or their limbs felt heavy and unreliable. It looked like a nerve disease that came from nowhere, and it confused wards that had just managed a stomach emergency. Then a third sign began to appear, and it was hard to ignore. Hair started falling out, often in dramatic clumps, sometimes across the scalp, eyebrows, and body. It did not happen on day one, so it arrived like proof that something deeper had taken hold. Put together, the sequence became a clinical signature. Gut illness first, then nerve injury, then sudden baldness. Doctors and poison specialists wrote it down, compared notes, and learned to recognize the pattern. Thallium had left a trackable fingerprint on the human body. Once doctors recognized the pattern, investigators finally had something to hold on to. The next step came in the lab. Newer tests started searching for metals, not just common drugs, and thallium began turning up where no one expected it. Old cases that had seemed like natural decline suddenly looked different. A death that had been ruled infection or a sickness blamed on nerves gained a new possibility. Forensic teams learned where thallium hid and how long it stayed. It appeared in blood early, then lingered in urine, hair, and nails, leaving a timeline behind. That mattered because poisoning rarely looked dramatic at first. Victims often went home, worsened over days, and returned with nerve pain and weakness that confused everyone. With the right samples, investigators stopped guessing. They measured it. As results became reliable, thallium changed in the public record. It no longer belonged only to accidents and medicine gone wrong. It became evidence. Prosecutors could connect a bottle of pesticide to a body or link multiple sick relatives to a single source. The idea of an undetectable poison faded, replaced by a hard lesson. A mystery illness sometimes came from a deliberate hand, and the lab could prove it. By the 1970s, thallium no longer looked like a routine pest killer. It looked like a weapon that kept slipping into ordinary life. A series of high-profile poisonings made headlines and unsettled investigators because the pattern was now familiar. Sudden stomach illness, then nerve pain, then hair loss. The danger was not just the chemistry, it was the convenience. Thallium still sat in products people could buy. Each major case created the same chain reaction. Hospitals struggled, police asked how the poison was obtained, and laboratories confirmed what had once been hard to prove. Public officials then faced a blunt question: why was an element with such a reputation still sold as a rodenticide? Thallium salts killed rats effectively, but they also harmed pets, children, and anyone who touched contaminated bait. The margin for error stayed close to zero, so governments acted. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, restrictions tightened, registrations changed, and in many places, thallium-based rodenticides disappeared from shelves entirely. It did not erase thallium from the world, but it reshaped access. The casual path from hardware store to poisoning began to close. That shift mattered. It reduced impulsive misuse, limited criminal opportunity, and pushed this toxic metal out of everyday homes. By the late 20th century, thallium stopped being the poison people found in cupboards. Regulations squeezed it out of everyday pest control, and its value shifted into narrow, technical jobs. Industry wanted it for properties that seemed almost made for modern electronics. It turned up in specialized glass, in certain detectors, and in components where tiny chemical advantages mattered. Access shrank for the public. Use concentrated behind gates and warning signs. That change did not end the danger. It moved it. Risk now followed the supply chain. Refining, manufacturing, and disposal. Workers handled thallium compounds in controlled processes, but control sometimes failed through dust, spills, or contaminated surfaces carried out on clothing. The poison no longer needed to be swallowed from a bait. It could be breathed in or absorbed in small amounts over time. The setting looked safer. The exposure became harder to notice. And when thallium left the factory, it often left as waste. Industrial byproducts and poorly managed disposal created a new kind of threat: environmental contamination. Once in soil or water, thallium did not announce itself, and it did not stay neatly contained. It could enter local food chains, reach communities far from the original plant, and linger for years. The story of thallium became less about a single victim. It became about systems that leaked. Modern medicine faced a hard truth. Thallium poisoning rarely announced itself clearly. Early symptoms looked like common stomach illness, and by the time the nerve pain and hair loss appeared, damage already spread through the body. But toxicology changed that timeline. Doctors learned to suspect thallium sooner, and labs began confirming it faster. A poisoning that once unfolded in the dark started to become a race with a visible finish line. The biggest shift came from treatment that targeted the poison itself. Prussian blue, a compound long known for binding certain metals, entered hospitals as an antidotal tool. Inside the gut, it trapped thallium and kept it from cycling back into the blood. That simple idea changed everything. Remove what could still be removed. Alongside it, clinicians pushed aggressive supportive care and careful monitoring, turning helpless waiting into active intervention. Better testing completed the transformation. Analytical methods grew sensitive enough to measure tiny amounts in blood and urine, then track whether treatment actually lowered the burden. That feedback guided decisions day by day, not by guesswork. Poisoning stopped being a mysterious decline and became a diagnosable emergency with a plan. Survival no longer depended on luck alone. The outcome depended on speed, detection, and getting the right therapy in time. By the time modern rules caught up, Thallium stopped being a casual purchase. It got treated like what it proved to be, a high-risk poison with too many ways to slip through normal life unnoticed. Sales tightened, storage standards hardened, paper trails followed shipments, access narrowed to places that handled it for a reason, not for convenience. And that single change, control, removed the everyday chance encounters that had fueled so many accidents and crimes. Even then, thallium never vanished. It stayed useful in specialized industrial work, so it stayed present, just behind more locked doors. That shifted the danger. The threat no longer sat in cupboards. It sat in workplaces, in waste streams, and in mistakes that traveled farther than expected. Exposure became less about a one-time household product and more about handling, disposal, and oversight. Risk turned into a systems problem, not a consumer choice. Yet its reputation kept pace. Thallium remained a name that surfaced whenever poisoning stories got told, because its history carried a particular cold logic. Small doses, delayed clues, and suffering that looked like something else until it was too late. In true crime memory, it stayed infamous, even as regulation boxed it in. That contrast lingered. In 1861, it began as a clean green line in a spectroscope. Later, it became a warning.